If you ask most people to name the most famous tank of World War II, they will probably say the German Tiger, a massive, heavily armored beast that could destroy almost anything on the battlefield from distances that made return fire nearly impossible. And they would be right. The Tiger was an extraordinary machine. It was also produced in numbers so small that it was essentially irrelevant to the outcome of the war. Germany built about 350 Tigers in total. Now here's the question that changes everything. While Germany was building 350 Tigers, how many tanks was America building? The answer is 49,234 Sherman tanks. 49,234. My name is Eddie Arsenal, and today we are talking about the M4 Sherman, the tank that veterans called a death trap, that critics called a coffin on tracks, that burned so reliably when hit that German soldiers nicknamed it the Tommy Cooker, and that somehow, despite all of that, won the war in Europe. This is one of the most complicated and most debated stories in the entire history of armored warfare, because the Sherman was genuinely flawed in ways that got real people killed, and it was also genuinely brilliant in ways that are less obvious, but ultimately more important. And by the end of this video, I think you will understand something that most people who criticize the Sherman completely miss: that winning a war is not the same thing as winning individual tank battles, and that the Sherman was designed to win the war, not every duel. But before we get into the Sherman itself, we need to understand the state of American armor doctrine in the late 1930s, because the decisions made then, for reasons that made complete sense at the time, directly led to both the Sherman's strengths and its very real weaknesses. In the late 1930s, American military doctrine held that tanks were not primarily designed to fight other tanks. That was the job of dedicated tank destroyers, specialized vehicles whose sole purpose was to hunt and kill enemy armor. Tanks in American doctrine were supposed to support infantry, breaking through defensive lines, exploiting gaps, moving fast and deep into enemy territory to cut off supply lines and create chaos in the rear areas. This doctrine was not stupid. It was actually based on serious military thinking about how armored warfare should work, and it was the foundation on which the Sherman was designed. A fast, reliable, mechanically simple tank that could keep up with advancing infantry and cover enormous distances without breaking down. The M4 Sherman that emerged from this doctrine was powered by a radial aircraft engine, the Continental R975 in early versions, and later by various other power plants, including a Ford-built version of the Chrysler multibank engine. It weighed approximately 33 tons, moved at a top road speed of about 30 miles per hour, and had a range of roughly 120 miles on a full tank of fuel. For a medium tank in 1942, these were genuinely impressive performance numbers. The main armament was a 75mm gun, a weapon that was perfectly adequate for the tanks. It was designed to fight when the Sherman was first developed in 1941 and 1942. The 75mm could reliably penetrate the armor of any German tank then in service. The problem was that Germany did not stop developing tanks in 1942. While the Sherman was being produced in massive numbers, Germany was introducing the Panther and the Tiger, tanks with armor thick enough that the Sherman's 75mm gun could not reliably penetrate at combat ranges. The Panther in particular was a serious problem. It had frontal armor that the Sherman's 75mm gun simply could not penetrate from the front at any reasonable combat distance, and it mounted a long 75mm gun of its own that could destroy a Sherman from over 1,000 meters. When American tankers first encountered Panthers in significant numbers in Normandy in the summer of 1944, the results were often brutal. Sherman after Sherman was destroyed by Panthers that sat at long range and picked them off before they could get close enough to fight back effectively. The burning Sherman became a horrifyingly common sight in Normandy. The tank's tendency to catch fire when penetrated, caused by the propellant charges for the main gun being stored in an exposed position inside the hull, earned it the nickname Tommy Cooker among German soldiers. American tankers had their own nickname for this phenomenon. They called it brewing up, as in the tank is brewing up, meaning it's on fire, meaning get out right now, or you are going to die in a burning steel box. The survival rate for Sherman crews when their tank was penetrated and caught fire was horrifyingly low. The tank had escape hatches, but in the chaos of a penetrating hit and immediate fire, getting out before the ammunition cooked off was a matter of seconds, and not everyone had those seconds. Veterans who survived burning Shermans described the experience in terms that are almost impossible to read calmly. The heat, the smoke, the desperate scramble through hatches while the tank fills with burning, propellant gas, the screaming of crewmates who didn't make it. So, was the Sherman a death trap? For the crews inside it, facing Panthers and Tigers on the open ground of Normandy and the plains of Germany, the honest answer is yes, in many situations, it absolutely was. And I want to be very clear about something. I am not going to stand here and minimize what Sherman crews went through or pretend that the tank's flaws didn't matter because it won the war. They mattered enormously. People died because of them. But here is what is also true, and this is where the Sherman story becomes genuinely fascinating rather than just tragic. The Sherman was not designed to fight Panthers and Tigers. It was designed to fight the tanks that Germany had in 1941 and 1942, which it could do perfectly well. The failure was not primarily in the Sherman's design. It was in the American military's failure to upgrade the weapon fast enough when the threat changed. And that is a very different kind of failure, with very different lessons. Because here is the thing about the Sherman that its critics often overlook. In every category that wasn't direct armor-to-armor combat, the Sherman was either competitive or outright superior to the German tanks it faced. Mechanical reliability. The Sherman was extraordinarily reliable for a tank of its era. German tanks, particularly the Panther, were mechanically complex and prone to breakdowns. A Panther that broke down on the way to the battle was not going to kill any Shermans that day. There are documented cases of entire German armored formations losing significant percentages of their strength to mechanical breakdowns before even making contact with Allied forces, simply because German tanks were so mechanically complex and maintenance-intensive that keeping them running was a constant struggle. The Sherman, by contrast, was designed from the beginning for ease of maintenance. Parts were standardized and interchangeable. Mechanics could perform most repairs without specialized tools. A Sherman that broke down in the field could often be repaired in hours, not the days or weeks that a Panther repair might require. Speed and mobility. The Sherman's 30-mile-per-hour road speed and reliable cross-country mobility gave American armored formations an operational agility that German heavy tanks simply could not match. A Tiger tank had a top speed of about 23 miles per hour on roads and significantly less cross-country. It also consumed fuel at an extraordinary rate and had a range of only about 60 to 70 miles on roads, less than half the Sherman's range. In the sweeping mobile warfare of the Western Front in 1944 and 1945, with American armored divisions covering hundreds of miles in days during breakout operations, the Sherman's mobility and range were not minor advantages. They were decisive ones. Patton's Third Army during the breakout from Normandy in August 1944 covered distances that simply would not have been possible with German-style heavy tanks. The operational tempo that defeated Germany in the West was built on the Sherman's ability to keep moving. Production. And this is the category where the Sherman's advantage over German tanks was so enormous that it almost makes the individual technical comparisons irrelevant. The United States built 49 234 Shermans. Germany built 347 Tigers, and 6,000 Panthers. But the production story is even more dramatic than those numbers suggest, because the Sherman was also supplied in huge numbers to America's allies. Britain received over 17,000 Shermans through Lend-Lease. The Soviet Union received over 4,000. France, Poland, and other allied nations received thousands more. The total number of Shermans that fought in World War II on the Allied side was staggering, and every one of those tanks represented a crew of 5 men who could fight, an armored vehicle that could absorb fire and continue operations, and the logistics chain that could keep them fueled, armed, and repaired. German tank crews were extraordinarily well-trained and often individually superior to their Allied counterparts in technical tank fighting skills. Individual German tanks, particularly Tigers and Panthers, frequently destroyed multiple Allied tanks in single engagements. But here is the brutal mathematics of industrial warfare. If a Tiger destroys 5 Shermans before being knocked out, and America produces 50 Shermans for every Tiger Germany produces, then America wins. Not elegantly, not without terrible cost, but wins. This was the fundamental strategic reality that American war planners understood, and that German planners, who kept building bigger, heavier, more complex tanks, never fully came to terms with. You cannot out-quality a production advantage of that magnitude. Now let's talk about the upgrades, because the Sherman story doesn't end with the basic M4. As the war progressed and the threat evolved, the Sherman evolved with it, and some of the upgraded variants were genuinely capable fighting machines. The most significant upgrade was the introduction of the 76mm gun, a longer, higher-velocity weapon that could penetrate Panther armor under the right conditions and significantly improved the Sherman's ability to fight back against heavier German armor. The 76mm Sherman began reaching Allied units in meaningful numbers in late 1944, later than it should have, and a source of genuine frustration for tankers who had been fighting with the 75mm since Normandy, but it made a real difference when it arrived. The British developed their own high-velocity gun upgrade for the Sherman, the 17-pounder, a truly excellent anti-tank gun that could penetrate Tiger armor reliably. This variant was called the Sherman Firefly, and it became one of the most effective tank killers on the Western Front. German tankers specifically targeted Fireflies in battle because they knew that the long gun barrel identified the most dangerous Sherman in any formation, and destroying it first was the smartest tactical move. Being singled out as the priority target was, in a strange way, the ultimate complement to the Firefly's effectiveness. There were other significant upgrades as well. Wet stowage systems for the ammunition that dramatically reduced the risk of catastrophic fire when the tank was penetrated, improved armor layouts on later production variants, and better gun stabilization systems that improved accuracy while moving. The wet stowage system in particular was a critical improvement. It surrounded the propellant charges with a water glycol mixture that absorbed heat from a penetrating round and dramatically reduced the chance of the ammunition igniting. Shermans equipped with wet stowage had significantly lower fire rates when penetrated. By the end of the war, the Sherman had evolved considerably from the tank that had first landed in North Africa in 1942. Better armed, better protected against fire, and better suited to the actual combat environment it faced. The lessons learned in blood in Normandy were not wasted. Now I want to talk about a specific moment in the Sherman's history that I think perfectly captures both its limitations and its ultimate importance: the Battle of the Bulge, December 1944. When Germany launched its massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes in December 1944, American forces were caught by surprise and initially overrun in several sectors. German armor, including Tiger and Panther tanks, pushed deep into Allied lines and threatened to split the Allied front. In the desperate fighting that followed, Sherman crews faced German heavy armor in brutal close quarters, fighting in the snow and fog of the Ardennes forest, exactly the kind of individual tank versus tank combat where German tanks had the greatest advantage. And many Shermans were destroyed. There is no sugarcoating that. In individual engagements, German tanks often won. But here is what happened at the operational level. American armored formations, built around the Sherman's mobility and reliability, responded faster than German planners anticipated. Patton's Third Army, equipped with Shermans, made one of the most remarkable military maneuvers of the entire war, turning 90 degrees in winter conditions and driving north to relieve Bastogne in just 3 days. That kind of operational speed was only possible because the Sherman could do it. A Tiger-equipped army could not have made that turn in that time. The logistics alone would have been impossible. Tiger tanks consumed fuel at rates that made the kind of rapid, sustained movement Patton executed essentially unachievable. The Battle of the Bulge ended in German defeat, not because American tanks won every tank duel, they didn't, but because American armored formations could move, respond, and sustain operations at a pace that German forces, with their heavier, less reliable, more fuel-hungry tanks, simply could not match. That is the Sherman story in miniature. It lost many of the battles, but it won the campaign. It lost many of the duels, but it won the war. And that is exactly what it was designed to do. Now let's talk about the Pacific theater, because the Sherman's story in the Pacific is dramatically different from its story in Europe, and it reveals yet another dimension of this remarkably versatile tank. In the Pacific, the Sherman faced a completely different threat environment. Japan had not developed heavy tanks comparable to the Panther or Tiger. Japanese armor was generally lighter, less well-armored, and armed with guns that had difficulty penetrating Sherman armor from most angles. In the Pacific, the Sherman was not a death trap. It was a virtually invulnerable behemoth. Japanese anti-tank weapons struggled to penetrate Sherman armor reliably, and Japanese tanks were simply outclassed in every category. The famous tank battle on Saipan in 1944 saw Japanese armor, Type 97 Chiha tanks, charge American Shermans in a desperate night attack. The results were catastrophic for the Japanese. Sherman main guns destroyed Japanese tanks with ease, while Japanese return fire bounced harmlessly off Sherman armor. In the brutal fighting for Pacific Islands, Shermans were used primarily to support Marine and Army infantry in assaulting Japanese fortifications, bunkers, caves, and fortified positions that infantry alone struggled to reduce. In this role, the Sherman was extraordinarily effective. The combination of the Sherman's 75mm gun firing high-explosive rounds directly into Japanese bunker openings, combined with the tank's ability to absorb small arms fire and light artillery while maneuvering close to enemy positions, made it a priceless asset in Pacific Island fighting. Marines who fought on Iwo Jima, Peleliu, and Okinawa consistently rated Sherman tank support as one of the most valuable assets available to them, not because the Sherman was perfect, but because in the Pacific context, it was exactly what was needed. So the same tank that Sherman crews in Normandy called a death trap was the tank that Marine infantry on Pacific Islands called their most valuable supporting weapon. Context matters enormously when evaluating the Sherman, and most criticisms of it focus exclusively on the European context. Let's also talk about the crews, because the men who fought inside Shermans deserve to be part of this conversation, not just the machines they operated. A Sherman crew consisted of 5 men: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and bow gunner. These 5 men lived inside the tank, fought inside the tank, and in too many cases died inside the tank. The training that American tank crews received was extensive by the standards of the time, but nothing could fully prepare a 19-year-old from Iowa or Texas for the reality of closing the hatch on a Sherman tank and advancing toward a line of German guns. Veterans who survived Sherman combat consistently described the same mix of emotions: pride in their machine's reliability and their unit's effectiveness, respect for the German tanks they faced, grief for the crewmates they lost, and a complicated relationship with a vehicle that both protected them and sometimes failed them catastrophically. There is a particular kind of bond that forms between men who share a small metal box under fire, and Sherman crews had that bond in full measure. The 5-man crew of a tank was in many ways a closer unit than any other combat team in the war, because they shared every second of every engagement with each other. Many Sherman veterans speak about their tanks with a complicated affection, acknowledging its flaws, mourning the friends they lost in burning ones, but also crediting it with bringing them home when so many others didn't make it. The Sherman was their home, their weapon, and their refuge all at once. Now let's look at the Sherman's legacy, because this tank did not simply disappear at the end of World War II. Its story continued for decades, in ways that further complicate and enrich our understanding of just how capable this vehicle actually was. The Sherman served in the Korean War, where it faced North Korean T-34 tanks, Soviet-built medium tanks that had been the terror of the Eastern Front, and acquitted itself well. The Korean War Sherman was upgraded with better guns and equipment, and proved competitive in the conditions of that conflict. In the Middle East, the Sherman had perhaps its most remarkable post-war career. Israel received Shermans from various sources after World War II, and began an extraordinary program of upgrading and modifying them that continued for decades. Israeli engineers fitted Shermans with the French CN 75-50 gun, then with the massive 105mm gun, creating what became known as the Super Sherman, and later the M51. These radically upgraded vehicles fought in the 1948, 1956, 1967, and even the 1973 Arab-Israeli wars. Think about that timeline. A tank designed in 1941 was still being upgraded and used in frontline combat in 1973. 32 years of frontline service, spanning 3 decades of enormous technological change in armored warfare. The Sherman's longevity in Israeli service is perhaps the most remarkable testament to the fundamental soundness of its basic design. The chassis, the running gear, the overall architecture of the vehicle proved adaptable enough to accept increasingly powerful weapons and equipment for over 3 decades. South American nations also operated Shermans well into the Cold War era, with some remaining in service into the 1990s, more than 50 years after the first Sherman rolled off the production line in 1941. 50 years of service for a tank that critics called a death trap. The Sherman's total production numbers are staggering in the full context of the war. By the end of production, approximately 49 234M4 series tanks of all variants had been built by American manufacturers, making it the second most produced Allied tank after the Soviet T-34. Those 49 234 Shermans were built by workers, men and women in factories across America, who understood that every tank they built might be the one that brought a husband or son or brother home from Europe or the Pacific. The production of Shermans was not just an industrial achievement, it was a human one. There is a famous photograph of a Sherman rolling off a production line at the Detroit tank arsenal with a sign on it reading, "Knock on this." The sign was a message from the factory workers to the German soldiers who would eventually be on the other side of that tank's gun. It captures something essential about the spirit in which these tanks were built. And that spirit, that willingness to produce, to keep producing, to flood the battlefield with armor and firepower until the enemy simply ran out of everything, was ultimately more decisive than any technical specification could be. The M4 Sherman was imperfect. It was outgunned and out-armored by the best German tanks. It burned when it was hit, and it killed good men inside those fires. These are facts, and they should never be minimized or forgotten. But it was also reliable, fast, mechanically simple, and produced in numbers that overwhelmed everything Germany could put on the field. It was the tank that American industry could build in tens of thousands, while Germany was struggling to build thousands. And it was the tank that drove all the way to Berlin. The M4 Sherman, called a death trap, called a Tommy Cooker, called a coffin on tracks, and also the tank that crossed France, crossed the Rhine, and ended the war in Europe. Sometimes the weapon that wins the war is not the best weapon on the battlefield. It is the one that shows up in enough numbers, in enough places, at enough times, to make victory mathematically inevitable. And that is the Sherman's story. Complicated, painful, brilliant, and ultimately triumphant. The death trap that saved the world. If you want to know about the weapon that American infantry used alongside those Shermans, the submachine gun that became the most iconic American weapon of the entire war, that story is coming next. Subscribe to Eddie Arsenal, hit that bell, and I will see you in the next one. Let's load it up.